Hello and welcome back. Sean here, Mountains Garage, on a beautiful Saturday morning. In the last video, we talked about the basics of ignition timing and your average distributor, be it points, dual point, electronic ignition, whatever. It has an internal advanced mechanism. So you have base timing, the timing curve that's built into the distributor, and your total timing. As you go up the performance scale, your expectations of your horsepower output, it's definitely time to secure an improved ignition system. And there's a lot of choices out there. You can add a multi-spark discharge box to all the distributors we mentioned in the last video. That is not necessarily timing, that's just to increase the power of the spark. We're still talking about controlling the timing. And you have a few choices, but when you step into a performance distributor, you no longer have the advanced mechanism inside the distributor. It is locked out. So you set the total timing that you desire, and in some cases, that's it. You don't control it any more than that. The first problem you're going to run into is you go to hit the starter with the ignition powered up, and it's going to not want to crank. It's going to buck against it, might rip the starter or the flywheel right out of your car, because it doesn't like high compression and 34, 36 degrees of timing. It's going to not want to crank. You can try to spin it over with the ignition off and hit the ignition. That actually works most of the time, but a much better option is you need an ignition control box, and with these style distributors you have to have those anyway. And the first function you want to wire up into the starter wire that triggers the starter motor is your start retard. So it takes your total timing, takes out a fixed amount, 20, 25 degrees, while you're cranking, and it allows the engine to start fairly normal with no extra tricks. So that's an important function. But like I mentioned, these two distributors in front of me will not function without the matching ignition box. And the ignition boxes, of course, can be bought at different levels with different functions. If you're naturally aspirated without a power adder, you might be all set with just a start retard, and as soon as the engine fires, it goes right back to the total timing, and you're good to go. But if you have nitrous oxide or a supercharger or a turbocharger, the more you spray the nitrous or the more boost you make, you need to retard the timing so you don't melt the engine down. We covered that a little bit in the last video, but that's the basic premise. You have to retard or slow down the timing event. To do that, you have, again, back in the old days, just like the start retard, you actually had little chips. You could select how much start retard you had, how much boost retard you had. You had little pills of chips you plugged into the box itself, along with rev limiter and a bunch of other stuff. There were also functions of the box, 2-step, 3-step, RPM control. But as far as timing goes, start retard and then boost or nitrous retard. And the old, we'll call them analog ignition boxes that would control that. The last MSD, they're probably the most prevalent ignition company, at least they were. I had a MSD 7AL, the gold box, which was premium in the 70s and 80s. But to add boost or timing control, you had to have another box. Same goes for RPM on the starting line and other stuff. You just kept stacking boxes. Eventually, they came into the modern age and you could buy one box that you can program with your laptop, and you can control your start retard, your boost retard, and you can use it for other things. Traction control. You can take timing out and put it back in multiple times on 1/8 a quarter mile pass to accomplish different things, which is light years ahead of the old style timing control, but hey, we all advance, no pun intended. So let's talk about the basics of what's in front of me. This is several different levels, if you will. This is your, we'll call it self-contained. It's an MSD Pro Billet. It has what will become a familiar looking plug, this little 2-wire square plug. Inside this distributor is the trigger for the ignition. Also, it distributes the spark. It's self-contained, other than you have a box mounted inside the car, probably, sometimes outside, but typically behind the firewall inside the car. And this will do everything in one neat package. What it lacks is the size of the distributor cap, because when you start manipulating timing, and we're going to get into rotor phasing in a minute, if you can spread the terminals of the cap further apart, and if the brass pieces inside can be a little bit bigger, you can keep the spark on the correct terminal when you start manipulating, retarding, and advancing the timing, all without moving the distributor. So this becomes, if you have a multi-stage nitrous system and you're retarding a lot of timing, you don't want the spark to find a different cylinder or a path to ground or whatever and blow your intake manifold off the engine, etc. You're trying to avoid that. So this is awesome up to a point. At the next level, you're going to want a crank trigger. This takes a little pickup that's inside the distributor and moves it on to the harmonic balancer with a pickup that's bolted to the engine. It's much more accurate. Your timing is now adjustable right here instead of having to turn the distributor, which affects your rotor phasing. And all the distributor does itself is just distribute the spark. There's nothing else in here. It's just a rotor button headed to the terminal caps. So, and it's wide, it's very widespread. This particular one goes in the traditional Chevrolet location, but if you have a belt drive camshaft, they make the same cap with a bracket and a little small belt that runs off your camshaft, and it's right up front where you can work on it. But your only concern now with this is, one, that it points to the correct cylinder. That's when you install it, that's the basics, but you want to check your rotor phasing on this, so it seems like the time now to talk about rotor phasing. MSD wants you to buy a sacrificial cap and bore a hole in it and watch the actual spark with a timing light, and the trick is you want to be on the leading edge. You can actually see the spark jumping between the rotor button and the cap, and depending on how much retard you're going to pull out of the timing, you want to make sure when that happens, you're still on the terminal. And the closer to the middle, the better, but you'll be surprised how far that will, if you actually go off the terminal, it'll still jump back where it's supposed to go until it finds an easier path. So you actually check rotor phasing, and you don't want to get that wrong, but it's not hard to do either. So setting up the crank trigger is really easy. You just put the engine at the total timing figure you want. Your balancer has a degree wheel etched into it. You've already checked it when you assembled the engine, hopefully, and so when it's showing 0 top dead center, that's accurate. So when you set your total timing at whatever you want, 32, 34, you just line up this, lock it down with your engine in the correct position. And as long as your rotor button is pointing to the correct cylinder and is phased properly, so again, when you retard it, you're not going to pull it off the terminal. This is probably the most accurate method going. And I'm still talking, carburetors and ignition distributors, but even with modern EFI, that most of the engines, even if you retrofit a smaller big block Chevy, you're probably still going to run the crank trigger. And for a cam sync, you actually have what looks like a distributor with just a couple wires coming out of it, and that's your cam position sensor. And just like modern EFI, it uses that information and can control the timing, I guess even easier, if you will. Differently anyway, but you can take an old school engine and still run it, and you can even put sequential fuel injection on it. That's how you accomplish it, but you're still probably going to run the crank trigger because the traditional Chevy never had a way to have a reluctor wheel in the crankshaft or anything, so you need to accomplish the same thing and trigger, the crank position to the control box. So that works pretty well. Modern EFI, if you have like a Holley, Terminator, HP, or Dominator, is endless amounts of things you can do with the timing. With your laptop on a screen, you can make as many timing maps as you want to accomplish different functions. About everything we talked about, from start retard, traction control, everything. In that respect, once you learn how to use that software, it's a lot easier, if you will, than the old mechanical stuff. In the end, accomplishes basically the same thing. While we're talking about distributors, the Magneto is a self-contained unit. It has one wire sticking out of it, which is a ground wire. When the Magneto is ungrounded, it's going to make spark if it turns. So be prepared. If you don't have the switch grounding it, the engine's going to want to start. Still very popular in sprint cars and nitromethane drag racing. They still use two Magnetos, mag for short. And for all the reasons, they have large caps like we talked about, and I'm not sure, like in a sprint car, they do a lot of timing control. I doubt it. They probably just, they even push start it, so they probably don't even have a start retard. But in function, whether it's everyday street driving all the way to, like say, a sprint car or running nitromethane, all the concepts still apply, and you need to be aware of how to make your ignition, kind of fade into the background, not be an issue every time you go to start it or continue to hurt the engine because your timing's in the wrong spot. So hopefully anything I've said has been helpful. I love answering questions. And thanks for watching. I'll catch you in a couple days.